In December 1941, the United States entered the war after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Across the Pacific, Allied forces pushed westward from island to island, capturing Japanese soldiers in greater numbers as the years progressed. The United States, unaccustomed to holding many Japanese prisoners, found itself adapting to a new responsibility: how to treat those once deemed fanatical enemies. American military doctrine, constrained by the 1929 Geneva Convention, obligated fair treatment of prisoners of war, adequate food, shelter, medical care, and humane conditions. Yet implementing these standards in the Pacific War context proved challenging. Japan's own treatment of Allied POWs had frequently violated those norms, and many captured Japanese soldiers expected no mercy. Their military indoctrination stressed that surrender was dishonorable. From their perspective, to survive in American custody was already an inversion of expectation. The earliest Japanese POWs captured in the Pacific, on islands such as Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Saipan, were first held aboard naval vessels or makeshift camps before transport to the continental United States or to island bases under U.S. control. The numbers remained relatively small. Perhaps a few thousand Japanese personnel were interned in U.S. camps by the war's later years. Unlike German or Italian prisoners, the Japanese captive population in America was never large. Upon arrival, they entered camps in the Midwest or other inland states, segregated by nationality and under strict supervision. Their daily routine mirrored that of other POWs: roll calls, barracks cleanup, work details, where permitted, and limited recreation. But the psychological distance between captor and captive was sharp. Many Japanese soldiers assumed they would face harsh punishment, or even death. Instead, they found food, shelter, basic comfort, and, in some camps, shared items that astonished them. Among these, cigarettes shared by American guards or made available through canteens. The practice of providing cigarettes to POWs was not unique to Japanese prisoners. Tobacco had long served as a rationable commodity and a morale tool. Red Cross parcels sent to POW camps often included tobacco and cigarettes as standard items. In American camps, prisoners could sometimes purchase cigarettes from internal canteens, or they might receive them in allocated rations. What made the Japanese experience remarkable was the sense of generosity they perceived. In some accounts, U.S. guards voluntarily offered cigarettes or conversed with POWs, gestures that struck many Japanese men as inconceivable for how enemies should behave. These interactions, small as they were, often shaped prisoners' attitudes. Such offerings unsettled the world view of men who had been taught that the enemy was ruthless and that surrender was shameful. To accept a cigarette was not merely to inhale tobacco. It was to pause, to observe, and perhaps to reconsider one's assumptions about the other side. This story of shared cigarettes thus becomes more than a curiosity. It frames a moment when war's human dimension intrudes, where captor meets captive, not in conflict, but in small courtesy. It reveals how adherence to convention, material abundance, and psychological openness intersected inside POW camps. The administration of Japanese POWs in U.S. custody was governed by both military regulation and logistical precision. Camps were designed to mirror standard Army layouts: perimeter fencing, guard towers, barracks blocks, and mess halls. The same infrastructure used for German and Italian prisoners was applied on a smaller scale for Japanese captives. Cigarettes, like food and medical supplies, were accounted for in quartermaster inventories and distributed under supervision. The U.S. Army treated tobacco as both a rationed comfort and a stabilizing influence. Among soldiers and prisoners alike, nicotine provided routine, calm, and, indirectly, control. Tobacco shipments to POW camps moved through the same supply channels as U.S. military rations. American manufacturing capacity ensured a steady flow. By 1944, companies like Lucky Strike Camel, and Chesterfield were producing billions of cigarettes per year. These brands were not only available to American troops overseas, but also reached POW compounds on U.S. soil. Cigarettes appeared in Red Cross parcels, canteen sales, and direct issue. In some camps, guards informally shared their own supply, an unrecorded but not uncommon gesture of familiarity. To the Japanese prisoners, this abundance reflected a technological and industrial scale far beyond their nation's wartime capacity. Japan's home front suffered from shortages in nearly every commodity. Tobacco had been rationed to Japanese troops even before 1943, and cigarettes often doubled as trade currency. Seeing Americans distribute them casually, even to captives, was a material lesson in the disparity of resources that defined the Pacific War. The cigarette thus became a quiet symbol of the vast logistical superiority that underpinned the Allied victory. 114, an object small enough to hold, yet representative of an empire of production that Japan could never match. For many Japanese soldiers, capture was a rupture not only of freedom, but of identity. Their military training and cultural conditioning had equated surrender with shame. Propaganda told them that Allied forces tortured or executed prisoners. Suicide was often encouraged over captivity. When American guards instead offered water, food, and cigarettes, the effect was profound confusion. Some accounts from post-war interviews describe disbelief, a sense that such treatment was a trick, or that they were being mocked. It took days or weeks before many prisoners accepted that their survival was guaranteed, and that their captors bore them no personal malice. Cigarettes, exchanged across the wire or passed hand to hand, became one of the first forms of human contact, unmediated by fear. Smoking, universal and wordless, offered a kind of temporary equality. It allowed both guard and prisoner to occupy a neutral moment, sharing silence rather than hostility. For Japanese men who had been told Americans were brutal and uncivilized, these gestures destabilized deep-seated prejudice. Psychologically, such encounters often marked the first step toward rehumanization. Many Japanese POWs later recalled that the smallest acts of fairness, a shared smoke, a medical check, a guard who smiled, altered their understanding of the enemy. Over time, this recognition reduced tension and contributed to discipline within the camps. What began as an object of craving turned into a bridge of comprehension, linking men divided by language, ideology, and war. Within the U.S. military hierarchy, the handling of Japanese POWs required both firmness and restraint. The War Department issued standardized directives that applied the Geneva Convention to all Axis prisoners, though with heightened vigilance in the case of Japanese captives. Early intelligence reports described them as indoctrinated, resistant, and potentially suicidal. To prevent unrest, camp commandants maintained close oversight of discipline and morale. Cigarette distribution, along with food and recreational programs, became part of a calculated management strategy, offering controlled comforts to maintain order. American officers recognized that humane treatment served multiple functions. It reduced the likelihood of rebellion, demonstrated adherence to law, and potentially yielded intelligence through voluntary cooperation. In some cases, Japanese prisoners who experienced unexpected kindness were more forthcoming in interrogation, offering logistical or cultural information. Commanders thus saw decency not as sentimentality, but as an operational tool. At higher levels, such treatment reflected deliberate policy. The U.S. understood that how it managed POWs would shape its post-war reputation in Asia. The contrast between American behavior and reports of Japanese atrocities in the Philippines, Singapore, and Burma reinforced the perception of moral asymmetry. Sharing cigarettes or ensuring fair rations, therefore, was not only humane but also politically symbolic, a demonstration of American discipline in contrast to Axis cruelty. The moral weight of humane treatment toward Japanese POWs extended far beyond the fences. It challenged stereotypes on both sides. For the Americans, it proved that restraint could coexist with victory. For the Japanese, it revealed that strength did not always express itself through dominance or vengeance. These insights, small as they seemed, became fragments of the moral reconstruction that followed the war. Strategically, this behavior functioned as soft power. Word of fair treatment filtered through Red Cross reports, and, later, through repatriated prisoners. When the war ended, such accounts contributed to Japan's acceptance of occupation under American leadership. Former POWs, once indoctrinated against the West, often became voices of moderation in post-war Japanese society. Their testimony that American soldiers had shared food and cigarettes with their captives contradicted wartime propaganda and humanized the occupier. The symbolism of the cigarette thus reached beyond habit. It stood for the moral authority the United States sought to project, a nation capable of overwhelming force, yet committed to civilized conduct. In the ashes of total war, such details mattered. They helped define the moral geography of the post-war world, in which America's legitimacy rested as much on restraint as on power. The tide of war in the Pacific turned sharply in 1944. The U.S. advance across the Central Pacific, through the Marianas, the Philippines, and toward Iwo Jima, brought not only immense casualties, but also unprecedented numbers of Japanese prisoners. Until then, surrender had been rare. Most Japanese troops chose death over capture. But by 1944, the exhaustion of Japan's forces, hunger, and the destruction of their command structures made captivity unavoidable. For the first time, the U.S. military had to handle Japanese prisoners in significant numbers, often amid the chaos of combat. The Battle of Saipan in June and July 1944 marked the first large-scale capture of Japanese soldiers and civilians. Out of roughly 30,000 defenders, only a few hundred survived to be taken prisoner. Many of them were stunned by their own survival, expecting execution or starvation. Instead, they received medical care, food, and even cigarettes from the same Marines who had fought them days before. Eyewitness accounts describe American corpsmen tending to Japanese wounded under fire, offering water and tobacco while awaiting evacuation. Such moments became quietly emblematic of the U.S. conduct of war, ferocious in battle, yet deliberate in restraint once the fighting ended. Those prisoners were later transferred to camps in Hawaii, the mainland United States, and the Pacific rear bases. The pattern repeated at Guam, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. At each stage, the American military faced the same paradox: the enemy's refusal to surrender willingly and, simultaneously, the responsibility to treat survivors with dignity. On Iwo Jima, where nearly 21,000 Japanese fought to the death, fewer than 300 were captured alive. Among them were men half buried in tunnels or unconscious from wounds, awakened in disbelief to find medical teams dressing their injuries and guards lighting cigarettes beside them. These acts were not isolated gestures. They reflected an institutional ethos that distinguished American treatment of prisoners from that of Japan. In a war defined by hatred and atrocity, such decency stood out as anomalous. When news of it spread among other Japanese units, it created ripples of doubt within the ranks. Soldiers were told that capture meant certain death. Yet survivors returned with stories of food, rest, and humane treatment. The climax of this quiet transformation came in the Philippines campaign of 1945. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, cut off in the mountains and jungles, began surrendering in small groups. Many carried leaflets dropped by U.S. aircraft, printed in Japanese, promising safety and respect under American custody. These leaflets drew credibility from earlier accounts of humane treatment, stories of cigarettes and clean water, not torture. By the final months of the war, American policy toward POWs had become a subtle psychological weapon. It was not just a matter of compliance with Geneva law, but an element of strategy. Winning Japan's surrender required more than military destruction. It required dismantling the fear that surrender meant dishonor and death. When Japan finally capitulated in August 1945, the surrender unleashed a vast and disordered tide of humanity. On islands across the Pacific, tens of thousands of surviving Japanese soldiers laid down their arms. Many emerged from caves or jungles emaciated, sick, and half convinced they would be executed. Instead, they found organized reception points run by U.S. and Allied troops, medical tents, ration lines, and processing stations. It was there, again, that small gestures confirmed a new reality. Cigarettes extended by American soldiers, water canteens passed to trembling hands, rations shared without contempt. These scenes were captured in military photographs and post-war reports. They showed the transformation of the Japanese soldier's image, from fanatic adversary to exhausted human being. The act of sharing a cigarette became a symbolic, close to the Pacific War, a quiet punctuation to years of brutality. Many American veterans later recalled that moment. The instant they realized the enemy they had fought with such intensity was, at last, simply a man in need of rest. In U.S. camps across Okinawa, the Philippines, Guam, and later mainland Japan, the routine of captivity took shape quickly. Prisoners received medical examinations, disinfection, clothing, and rations equivalent to Allied standards. Smoking areas and canteens were established almost immediately. To the Americans, it was procedural. To the Japanese, it was extraordinary. Some POWs wept when offered cigarettes or sugar, believing they were being mocked. Others bowed repeatedly in silence, unable to reconcile the gesture with the image of the enemy they had carried throughout the war. In post-surrender Japan, as prisoners were repatriated, these stories spread quickly. They reached families who had been told that Allied troops were barbaric. The narrative shifted. American soldiers had not only spared their sons and brothers, but treated them decently. This word-of-mouth testimony became a quiet but influential current in Japan's early post-war perception of the United States. The U.S. Occupation Authority, under General Douglas MacArthur, took notice. Reports from POW camps were used as examples in orientation programs for Japanese civilians, illustrating American discipline and fairness. Tobacco companies, too, recognized its soft power role. By 1946, American cigarettes such as Lucky Strike and Chesterfield were available under Allied control in Japan, associated now not with humiliation, but with modernity. The cigarette that had passed between guard and prisoner on the battlefields of Saipan or Okinawa became an emblem of this new era. It represented the quiet bridge between conqueror and conquered, a moment where survival eclipsed ideology. In the aftermath of total war, these exchanges stood as living evidence that humanity had not been entirely consumed by hatred. In the years that followed Japan's surrender, the treatment of its prisoners in American custody emerged as an understated but meaningful component of post-war reconciliation. Approximately 132,000 Japanese soldiers were held by U.S. and Allied forces during the war, most captured after 1944, when large-scale surrenders finally began. Of those held by the United States, nearly all survived to be repatriated between 1945 and 1947. In contrast, tens of thousands of Japanese POWs held by the Soviet Union perished in labor camps in Siberia. The difference did not go unnoticed in Japan. The United States had entered the war with a formal commitment to the Geneva Convention of 1929, even though Japan had not ratified it. American policy toward POWs reflected a belief that humane treatment demonstrated moral strength. It was also practical. Well-treated prisoners could provide intelligence, reduce resistance, and weaken the myth of the honorable death. In U.S. camps, Japanese POWs were assigned agricultural, construction, or maintenance work. They were paid small wages, had access to libraries and chaplains, and could write letters home through the International Red Cross. Many were astonished by this degree of structure and fairness. The contrast with Japan's own treatment of Allied POWs was stark. American, British, and Australian prisoners under Japanese control had suffered starvation, beatings, and forced labor on railways and in mines. The news of those atrocities circulated widely after the war, and yet American policy remained consistent: retribution through justice, not cruelty. This restraint helped establish the moral legitimacy of the U.S. occupation. Japanese, civilians and returning POWs encountered a conquering nation that governed firmly but without vengeance. In the continental United States, Japanese POWs were housed at over 150 camps, from Texas to Wisconsin. Many were surprised to find themselves working on American farms, often alongside civilians. Reports from 1945 described Japanese laborers harvesting cotton or repairing fences under the supervision of farmers who, at first wary, grew accustomed to them. Some Americans shared food and cigarettes during breaks, their hostility dissolving with time. These small human interactions became a quiet counterpoint to the bitterness of the Pacific War. By 1946, as repatriation began, the U.S. Army and Red Cross documented the prisoners' reactions. Many expressed gratitude and disbelief. Some wrote that captivity had been the first time they had eaten regularly, received medical care, or been treated as equals by authority. The cigarette, offered freely by an American guard, remained a recurring symbol in their letters, a gesture they recalled more vividly than any political statement. When they returned home, these former prisoners often became informal ambassadors of a changed perspective. Their accounts clashed with wartime propaganda, which had painted the Allies as monsters. Instead, they described order, discipline, and even kindness. These testimonies did not erase the devastation of the war, but they softened the image of the United States at a critical time, as Japan began rebuilding under Allied supervision. The story of Japanese prisoners and the cigarettes shared with them by American soldiers reveals a quiet truth about the Pacific War, that even amid the most brutal conflict of the 20th century, human decency could still persist. It did not erase the horrors of Nanking, Bataan, or Okinawa, nor the cities burned to ash from Tokyo to Hiroshima. But in the small, unrecorded exchanges between captor and captive, something essential endured: the recognition of another's humanity, stripped of uniform and ideology. For the Americans, offering a cigarette was often instinctive, an act of routine courtesy, born from habit rather than strategy. For the Japanese soldier, it was transformative. It contradicted years of indoctrination that had painted the enemy as ruthless and inhuman. Many former POWs later said that this moment, brief and wordless, marked the first time they questioned what they had been taught. It opened a space, however small, for understanding that survival need not mean shame. These encounters also foreshadowed a broader shift in international norms. The humane treatment of POWs, once a matter of policy, began to carry political and moral significance. In the emerging post-war order, it became evidence of a nation's civilization. The United States' conduct in this area, documented, deliberate, and often overlooked, helped shape Japan's acceptance of the American-led occupation and its eventual alignment with the Western world. In the end, the cigarette shared between enemies was not just a token of mercy. It was an emblem of transition, from total war to uneasy peace, from hatred to coexistence. In the silence after the guns fell silent, gestures like these carried more weight than words. They spoke to what the war had nearly extinguished, yet somehow did not: the capacity for compassion, even between those who had once sought each other's destruction.